Hi there. Welcome to Transitions. We're broadcasting today from our satellite Hunters Bay studio at Nipissing University. I'm Anne Wagner, your host, and my guests today are Nick Marshall and Britt from Addiction Outreach. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Now, you both joined us before, and we just started the discussion, so you were good enough to come back for another round. The last time we were talking, and you were telling us a little bit about your work in elementary and secondary schools, and one of the things you were talking about was the fact that you practice a harm reduction model. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that means.
The essence of it is in what it's called, right? So we're reducing the harms, right? So it's looking at substance use and looking at addiction from a standpoint of what are the biggest harms you're experiencing on that day and time, and how can we reduce them? And it's not to say that more harms won't pop up, or different harms might pop up, but on that day and at that time, what are the biggest harms that you're experiencing, and how can we reduce them in your life?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, it's definitely just looking at, how do we reduce it? How do we reduce the substance use? If I'm struggling by being bullied at school, so I get stoned to go to class, okay, well, how do I change that? How do we get rid of the bully? How do we work through that situation, right? So we're not getting stoned before we go to class to handle that, right? Mm-hmm. Many times substance use is used to cope, right? So we got to lower the harm, right? We got to lower the negatives that are going on, so that we're not using or coping with the substance.
So it really is a broad-based approach where you're looking at the context and what's leading up to the use of substances as a coping strategy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of looking at it. So it isn't just using more safely in terms of how you're ingesting the substance. It looks at the social context and what's going on.
Yeah, it's looking at the whole package. I mean, the basis is just what are the harms directly of the use, but when we take it that step further and look at what are the harms that are promoting the use too, we need to reduce those harms as well, right? We can't just say, okay, this is damaging your lungs, so you need to reduce it. Well, that leaves me with nothing to deal with that stressor that's promoting me to use it, right?
Good point.
Yeah, there's definitely totally a lot of definitions in regards to harm reduction. You could look at the content, you could look at many different aspects. It could be, instead of hitting it out of a bong, I'm smoking a joint, right? So we could look at different ways of harm reduction in the sense of the substance as well, but also the content of what's going on.
So you've used the example of bullying, that might be a precursor to using as a coping mechanism. Can you suggest some other stressors that young people are generally facing that tend to lead to their substance use as a coping strategy often?
A big one's stress, homework, keeping up with grades, pressures at school.
Pressures at home.
Friends, peer pressure, just being able to concentrate in class, and having that. Yeah. Some say, I smoke pot because it helps me concentrate for that hour and 10 minutes in class, so there's...
Yeah, and looking at undiagnosed things like attention deficits or mental health things that haven't been diagnosed properly or haven't been addressed at all yet, and then where the substance use is kind of picking up the slack for those kind of unmet needs.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point, too. So sometimes it may be actually linked to something biological, like a learning disability or a mental health connection that hasn't really been addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and many times, I know I've heard, and for over my 5 years anyway, many times I hear, it's to concentrate or to help sleep or to help deal with stress. Those are usually my three big ones that I hear, and even to this day I hear.
Yep.
So...
And so then is that something you would work on with your client or with the young person in terms of what other coping mechanisms could you maybe develop?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and developing those tools, if it's a stress thing, is it looking at time management and helping them build schedules or routines, or is it looking at, what are the big stressors and can some of them even be removed? The great thing about Nick and I's position is we're in the school, so if it's a school-related stress, hey, can we go and meet and advocate with you to a principal or to a teacher? I've had students before that exam time is a really stressful time, so we look at, okay, instead of you increasing your marijuana use to deal with exams and then you do poorly on exams, can I go with you and talk to the principal or talk to the teacher about your exam coming up and maybe look at alternatives? Can you write it in a quiet space? Can you write it somewhere else? So really figuring out how to reduce the stressors that are promoting the use.
Yeah.
So that's a really important point, the fact that the two of you are located in the schools, but you're not positioned in the authority structure of the school.
Yeah, it's kind of a nice mix, really.
Yeah.
Being there, but having not the responsibility of being an authority figure.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in the sense that we can have a conversation with the kid and, we don't have to worry about whether they skip class.
Yeah.
We're not there to give them trouble because they skip class that day.
No.
Right? So it is kind of nice.
Yeah.
And it also gives them a safety valve, someone that can help them advocate for themselves and change structures and get their needs accommodated in a way that's safer than, I imagine, approaching a teacher and saying, you know what, I can't cope with the exam schedule. That would be a bit much or daunting often for young people.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they don't want to admit it, right? It's embarrassing. There's that embarrassed factor, too, of...
And fear judgment. I mean, addiction is still, as much as we're coming strides and, mental health and addiction kind of falling in that same spectrum of we still have endless amounts of stigma, that it's not an easy thing to come forward and say, I'm struggling with this, but I want to do better.
Right. And is that another aspect of your work, tackling that stigma?
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at the prevention stuff and just being out in the community, and both Nick and I do lots of community stuff where just being there. So reminding people that this is everywhere and this is, I wouldn't believe someone if they said they haven't known someone that's struggled or they haven't known someone that's experienced addiction. We all come across it in some way, shape, or form in our lifetime, So just making it not to normalize the use. I mean, that's not what we want to do. What we want people to be more comfortable to come forward and say, hey, this isn't manageable anymore. And, it's not helping me. So what can help me?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the biggest things I think we definitely push for. Substance use it's not a topic people want to talk about. It's a closed door as mental health was. Mental health has definitely taken huge strides in this of being open and, kids, that have learning disabilities or kids that struggle with ADHD or whatever, tend to get that extra bit of support in the sense of the school where, somebody with a smoking pot every day, they're probably getting suspended or expelled. We're doing more in trouble than we are in
rehabilitating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've talked about now substance abuse and the way it's linked to coping. What about in terms of substance abuse in recreational forms, people doing it for fun? Does that also come up in terms of your work with the young people?
Yeah, and I think that's another place where that harm reduction thing comes into play, right? Because it's not about saying you can never, ever, ever do this, They're young and they're going to experiment, whether it be in high school or into their post-secondary time or whenever. I mean, experimenting with substance use is a pretty common thing to see happening. So, it's having, like Nick had previously said, it's having that discussion around why are you using and what are the motivators, and if it's just, hey, I go and hang out with my buddies on the weekend and we happen to have some beers or we happen to have some pot, still making plans for, okay, but are we being safe? And do you recognize the signs and symptoms of, say, if you're drinking and someone starts puking, do you recognize that that's a sign of alcohol poisoning? And do you know what the steps are to follow, or do you just put them in bed and hope that they wake up okay in the morning?
So it's also, it sounds like there's an education component and being realistic that young people are likely to experiment or be around people who are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a huge education component. I think most of our job is education in regards to, just having them prepared for situations. That's the biggest thing, is being prepared for those risky situations. Like Britt said, and probably we've all done it, we've all been in those parties or whatever, right? But we need to be prepared for if something was to happen to a friend or, a buddy or whatever. We got to have that preparation, and I think that's a big piece of what me and Britt really try to push, and that is that harm reduction part, right, is keeping safe. We're not there to condone their use, we're there to help them stay safe if they are using.
Wonderful. So we have to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, but then we'll be back. Hi, welcome back to Transitions. Yeah, I'm Anne Wagner, and I'm chatting with Nick Marshall and Britt Colborne today. And you were just talking about how harm reduction fits into your work with young people in the high schools. And I'm wondering, with Reading Week and March break coming up, a lot of young people will be enjoying themselves, having some free time, maybe traveling, getting together with friends. And is there anything you do to get them to think about how they can reduce their risk when they are getting together and going to parties with friends?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, simple things like there's safe drinking guidelines that are out there that, going over those, so recognizing that there's different levels of alcohol that females can handle than males, and having those sorts of conversations, having conversations about safe things in terms of being safe with keeping your drinks covered or keeping your drinks with you, and worries about anything like that could be put out there. Having safety plans in terms of safe ride home and things like that, lots of just simple safety things that, there's different ways to, whether it's putting reminders in their phones or, writing up. I've done little cards before where you write up a little card that then you stick in your wallet. So then if they're out at a party or something and they open their wallet, they go, oh, shoot, I forgot Britt reminded me of this, and that. And it's not to say they're necessarily going to use those things all the time, but it's just when the conversation's been had, there's that thought in their head that before they get in a car or before they leave their drink or come back to their drink after having left it, that having that conversation might spark that instant of, oh yeah, this isn't the best decision for me right now.
Yeah, definitely, and I agree with Britt. And the other piece is looking at, listen to your body. Mm-hmm. Your body's going to tell you when enough is enough. And we really need to listen to that, mm-hmm. So you need to know your limits and being safe in regards to that, because that's how, mm-hmm. Overdoses occur. That's, those types of things. So really pushing to listen to their body if, they're feeling a little off or whatever, that isn't normal, being prepared, being able to have those phone numbers, remembering, keeping 50 cents in your pocket to make a call if you don't have your cell phone or if your cell phone died or whatever it is, right? Just making the little preparations.
Yeah, and I often joke with some of my clients, or not joke, but, put out there that ahead of time, have a conversation with your parent or guardian saying, okay, I'm going to a party tonight. If I happen to need to call you at 2 a.m, could we not have the argument about it till the next day or till 2 days from now, and contract with it ahead of time and make those plans ahead of time. I can imagine as a parent that having that plan in place ahead of time is a lot less scary than getting that 2 o'clock in the morning phone call that you're not expecting and you don't know where it came from, right? So not being afraid, and it doesn't work for all of our clients and all of our youth, but if you feel like you're comfortable with saying to mom or dad before you go out the door, hey, by the way, would it be okay if something happened and I needed that ride? Would that be okay? And could we kind of table the discussion around what happened or what state I was in until the next day or until, whenever, contracting that time, so that everybody's kind of safe and aware and there's some open, honest communication going on as well.
Yeah.
So it really can go beyond just the young person. They can involve their parents, they can involve their network, their support network in planning as well. And do you find that peer pressure, is that identified as an issue? That maybe they get into that situation and they didn't plan to drink so much, but then a drinking dream broke out or whatever happened, and they end up going past what they know to be their reasonable limits. Is that something that comes up with young people at all?
Definitely. I think they definitely get, caught up, I think, is more, I don't know, like it is peer pressure, but I think also they get caught up in the party. They get caught up in the fun and the excitement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why that reinforcement, of having the conversations that Britt and I have, is important, because they need to remember, right? Sooner or later, something's going to click. Eventually something clicks. But then again, it's just preparing people that are around them too, have those phone calls, have those phone numbers ready, and if it is 911, well, unfortunately it's 911, but at least, hey, it's a call made, and not being afraid of making the call. I think that's a big piece, is they're scared they're going to get in trouble. Right? Like, they have that fear of, I'm going to get in trouble if I call. Mm-hmm. And so having that conversation with your parents ahead of time of, what, let's talk about it tomorrow, just get me home tonight kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think with the peer pressure, again, it's just acknowledging that, yeah, it's going to exist and yeah, it's out there, but we can be prepared for it and we can not necessarily go with it if we don't want to. And it's not, I mean, it's not easy and it's not the funnest thing to say no to your friends when you're in that situation. But, you know, there's ways, I mean, in the elementary stuff, I really, with the grade 7, 8 students, you know, that time of transition, that time of starting high school where you're starting to go to those parties, we do small exercises around like ways to say no without saying no. You know, that Just Say No campaign, it's not as effective as, you know, coming up with plans and coming up with ways to say no without putting yourself in a place where you feel uncomfortable or you feel judged, you know. So it's important to recognize that while the peer pressure exists, I think a lot of students really do an awesome job of not going with the peer pressure too, you know, and really aren't as easily manipulated by their friends as we might sometimes believe that they are. You know, I think like Nick was saying, it's more likely that you get caught up in the excitement than it's more of a thrill thing than well, my friends forced me to do it thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is part of what your goal is, because you've mentioned going in and doing the prevention with the younger, in the children or youth in the elementary schools, is part of it also educating the community more broadly and parents?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've done parent nights, and we attend as much as we can to community events that are available. If we're invited, we tend to go.
Yeah,
we work our way around it and we go, that's for sure.
Yeah, whether it's, you know, we've had Meet the Teacher nights where we've been invited in to set up booths so the parents, as they're circulating through the school, can stop and chat with us in both the high schools and the elementary schools. So yeah, just making our faces known. And we even, you know, even with some of the youth, if we have youth that Nick and I think I can speak for both of us, that we build that relationship with, and we hear about the parent in the conversation all the time, you know, we encourage them to encourage their parent to reach out. Nick and I wouldn't be the one to see their parent, but we have other counselors available that can provide that family support. So it kind of does take some of the heat off of that young person's back, that the parent can go in and talk to someone, and we're all a team, so we're all on the same page, so all the same messaging is kind of going out.
And are you seeing, would you say, in the course of the time that you've been doing this work, are you seeing a shift? Are people more willing to start engaging with the topic? Or is it still largely veiled in secrecy?
I think it depends, really. You know, I think it's getting better, but I definitely think it's still a pretty hidden conversation, and it's a hard one to admit. You know, I think it's a struggle to admit that there's an addiction within my home. You know, that's a hard thing to say, you know, so it's still definitely stigmatized, and it's still definitely hidden a lot more than it should be, really. You know, the support is available, you know, and it could make life a little bit easier having that support, right? So I think it's still there for sure.
I mean, you see little strides, right? You see things like the newspapers publishing series. I remember, I think it was last winter, the local paper published a whole series on a local family that had dealt with this. So we see little strides where it's more prevalent and it's more being talked about. And I mean, addiction goes hand in hand with mental health. So as mental health gets talked about more, addiction is getting talked about more. But are people as ready and willing to talk about it in an open, that's my brother, sister, daughter, son, whatever? Not as much as we would love to see it happen. But can there be that open discussion from time to time? I think, like Nick said, it depends on the day, depends on the group, depends on what's going on. But it kind of swings both ways. And
what advice would you give to someone, a young person who says, you know, I'm worried about my friend, or I'm worried about a family member, and they're not quite sure who to turn to or where to go? What thoughts would you have for them?
I mean, just don't be afraid. I think I joke with a lot of my young clients that we all have that Jiminy Cricket. We all have that little voice inside of us that tells us if something isn't quite right. So if you're having that thought of I wonder, then it's time to wonder with someone, and it's time to stop wondering on your own, because that's a hard thing to do on your own, and that's a lot of weight to carry, whether it's your own use or someone you love's use. It's a hard battle to know what's safe, what's not safe, what you're worrying about, what you're not worrying about. So, like we've said, we're in the schools. If you can reach out to us in the schools, Nick or I. But if it's a guidance counselor, a teacher, a coach, whatever, just saying, hey, I might need to talk to someone. There's nothing wrong in saying that, and it's not saying that the issue is some huge giant issue. It's just saying that it's gotten to that point where your gut is saying, I need a little bit more guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just encouraging them to reach out for that support. It's basically what Britt said, follow your gut, and if you feel like there's something you just gotta talk about in regards to a family member's substance use or whatever, and don't want to go it alone, reach out, and need that support. Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a really good point on which to end, and I think that it's probably going to make a lot of inroads, the fact that you two are so approachable and that you're available in the schools, and that people don't have to self-identify. No one in their school will necessarily know they're seeing you. And the fact that you're so readily available is doing a lot towards getting people to come out and reach out for help.
Thanks.
So thanks both for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And if you have any questions or any comments about our show, you can reach us at transitions@hbr@gmail.com. That's transitions@hbr@gmail.com. That's all for today. We'll be back next week.